My beautiful sister.
I'm the most beautiful girl alive.
Yes, you are, our Jew.
She grew into a stunning young girl, the kind of beauty that made conversations pause and heads turn without permission. Her skin glowed like fresh palm oil under the sun, her eyes sharp, her waist slender, and her face looked like something the gods had carved on a quiet afternoon when they were in a good mood. And Olamma knew it. Oh, she knew it very well. Beauty sat on her head like a crown, and she wore it with the pride of a queen who had never known defeat. One afternoon, as she walked past the compound of a woman named Nkiru who was pounding yam, she stopped, looked her up and down, and laughed, a dry, cutting laugh that carried poison. Nkiru, why is your face like that? You look like someone who fought with fire and lost. Nkiru froze, the pencil hung in midair. Before she could speak, Olamma continued, waving her hand dramatically in front of her nose. And your compound smells. Is it poverty that is smelling like this? The woman's mouth trembled. Another day, she stood at the edge of Okeke's farm, folded her arms, and shouted, "Is this what you call a farm? Even my father's goats eat better than this." The word spread like harmattan fire. The villagers swallowed their anger at first, but pain has a voice that cannot stay silent forever. Soon, complaints reached Mozi. And like thunder summoned by lightning, Mozi stormed into the center of the village square, his eyes red, his chest rising and falling like a wounded lion. "Who?" he roared. "Who dared to shout at my daughter?" His voice shook the air. His sons were behind him, Obina cracking his knuckles, Kelechi rolling his neck, Chibuzo silent but deadly, and Somto glaring like a guard dog ready to tear flesh. "If anybody has a problem," Obina added, his voice low and dangerous, "face us, not her." The villagers lowered their eyes. Nobody wanted war with Mozi's household. But whispers began to grow in dark corners. "That girl has no respect. She will bring tears to that family. A child that is not corrected will correct the parents." Inside the compound, Adama stood like a lonely tree in a storm, her voice the only soft thing left. "Mozi," she pleaded, her eyes heavy with fear, "you are not helping her." Mozi waved her off. "She is my daughter." The brothers nodded. "She is our sister." And just like that, wisdom was thrown away like dirty water. Meanwhile, Olamma herself could not do the simplest things. One morning, Adama poured warm water for her bath, but the moment Olamma dipped her toe inside, she screamed as if death had grabbed her. "Mama! It is too cold. Do you want me to die?" Adama touched the water. It was warm. Still, Obina rushed forward, glaring at their mother. "Mama, why will you do this? Do you want her to fall sick?" Another day, Adama handed her a broom. "Sweep the compound." Olamma stared at it like it was a snake. "Mama, do I look like a maid?" She dropped it and walked away, her waist swaying proudly. Even tying her wrapper was a battle. She would stand there, frustrated, calling, "Somto, come and tie it for me." And Somto would come running. They did everything for her. Everything. And she learned nothing. Nothing except how to be served. Before we continue with this life lesson story, kindly subscribe to support this channel. While you sit back to enjoy this story, let us know how a father and 4 brothers allowed their only girl to spoil in this manner. Let's sit back and enjoy these African tales told by elders. Mozi was a man whose name carried weight long before his footsteps arrived. He was proud, not the empty pride of a man who had nothing, but the full, heavy pride of a man whose barns were bursting with harvest and whose hands had wrestled prosperity out of the stubborn earth. His back was broad, his voice deep, and his words final. People greeted him with both respect and carefulness, because Mozi was not a man who bent easily. Beside him stood Adama, his wife, the soft light to his fierce son. She was a woman of quiet strength, her beauty gentle but undeniable, her voice calm even in storm. She prayed more than she spoke, listened more than she argued, and loved more than anyone could see. Together, they had been blessed with 4 sons, each one carrying a different piece of their father's strength. Obinna, the first, walked like a man who had been born to protect. His shoulders were already carrying responsibilities nobody asked him to carry. Kelechi, the second, was loud enough for 3 people, his laughter filling spaces and his anger arriving just as quickly. Chibuzo, the third, spoke little, but his silence was not weakness. It was the silence of a man who saw everything and forgot nothing. And Somto, the last, was still half boy, half man, playful, curious, his eyes always searching for answers life had not yet given him. Their compound was alive with abundance. Their barns were always full. Their yams were fat. Their goats were many. Hunger did not know their address. When they walked through the village, people greeted them quickly. Mozi, good afternoon. Obinna, you are strong. Kelechi, your father is blessed. Respect followed them like a shadow. But inside that full house, there was an emptiness nobody spoke about loudly. It lived in quiet glances. It hid in unfinished sentences. It slept beside Adama at night and woke up with her in the morning. They wanted a female child like some family would want a male child. One day, Adama found out she was pregnant. One evening, they all sat together for dinner, the glow of the lantern dancing on their faces as they ate. The sound of chewing and plates filled the air until, then Adama broke the silence. I'm pregnant, she said. Everywhere became silent, then Somto's small voice broke through. Mama, he said slowly. Adama looked at him. Yes, my son. He hesitated. What if it's another boy? For a moment, silence held the table hostage. Then Kelechi laughed loudly. Obinna chuckled, shaking his head. It better be a girl, Obinna said, smiling. My friends are busy bragging about their sisters. I am tired of keeping quiet. Chibuzo smiled faintly but said nothing. All eyes turned to Mozi. He was quiet, his fingers still on his food, his face thoughtful. Then he spoke, his voice low but certain. I know she is a girl. They all looked at him. He lifted his head slightly, his eyes carrying a strange confidence. My princess is coming. The words hung in the air like a prophecy. Later that night, when everybody had fallen asleep and the compound was silent except for the sound of crickets, Adama knelt alone on the cold floor. Tears ran down her face freely, her hands trembling as she pressed them together. Please, she whispered into the darkness. Please give me a daughter. Her voice broke. She went to the shrine days later, her wrapper dragging on the ground as she carried sacrifices with shaking hands. She laid them down gently. I have given you my strength, she begged. I have given you my youth. Please, give me a daughter. She cried until her body was weak. She prayed until her voice was empty. She begged until all that was left was hope. The night Adama went into labor, the compound lost its breath. Her cries rose and fell like waves fighting against rocks, each sound cutting through the darkness and into the hearts of those waiting outside. Inside the small room, the midwife, Mama Nwobwis, moved with the urgency of experience, her hands steady, her voice firm. Adama, breathe, breathe, my daughter, the child is coming. Outside, the air was thick with tension. Mozi paced back and forth, his hands locked behind his back, his footsteps restless against the hard earth. His face was hard, his jaw tight, pretending to carry strength, but his eyes betrayed him. Every cry from Adama pierced him like a blade. Obinna stood nearby, his arms folded, staring at the door like he could force it to open with his will. Kelechi could not stay still. He walked in circles, muttering, she will be fine. Mama is strong, she will be fine. Chibuzo leaned against the wall, quiet, his face heavy with worry. Somto sat on a wooden stool, his small hands pressed together, whispering prayers he barely understood. Time moved slowly, cruelly. Then suddenly, Adama's cry rose louder than before, a long, desperate cry, and then, silence. The kind of silence that makes heart stop. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. The door remained closed. Mozi's chest rose and fell rapidly. "Why is nobody saying anything?" he whispered. Before fear could finish entering their hearts, the door creaked open. Mama Nwobwi stepped out. She was smiling. Smiling. For a moment, nobody understood. Then she spoke, her voice bright, victorious. "It's a girl." The word exploded. "A girl." Kelechi shouted. Obinna jumped to his feet. Somto screamed in joy. Chibuzo covered his face, smiling deeply. Mozi froze. He did not move. He did not speak. His lips trembled. "A girl," he asked quietly, like a man afraid the words would disappear if spoken too loudly. The midwife nodded. "Yes. Your princess." That was when Mozi's strength broke. He threw his head back. "My daughter," he roared. "My daughter is here." His voice shook the night. Ululation filled the compound as women rushed in, their voices rising in celebration. Neighbors began to gather. Joy spread like wildfire. Mozi turned to Obinna, his eyes shining. "Go," he commanded. "Bring down the fattest cow. Tonight, we celebrate the arrival of my jewel." The compound came alive with movement, laughter, and noise. The cow was slaughtered. Fires were lit. Songs were sung. And inside the room, Adama lay weak but smiling, her newborn child placed gently on her chest. Mozi entered slowly, his steps careful, his eyes fixed on the tiny face. He knelt beside them, his hands trembling as he touched the child. "Olamma," he whispered. "You are Olamma, the jewel of beauty." He looked at Adama, his voice breaking with gratitude. "You have completed my joy." Adama smiled softly, her fingers weakly stroking the baby's head. But deep inside her eyes, hidden beneath the smile, there was something else. Something small. Something quiet. A flicker of worry. From the moment Olamma learned how to stand, she decided she would never use her legs if there were people born to carry her. She would stand in the middle of the compound, her tiny hands stretched forward, her face already tightening with warning, and the moment nobody picked her up fast enough, she would drop to the ground and cry as if the earth itself had offended her. "Obinna." Adama would call from the kitchen, tired but patient. "Leave her. She must learn to walk." But Obinna would already be on his way, his strong young arms lifting his little sister like a fragile egg. "Come, my princess," he would say softly, placing her on his back. Olamma would stop crying immediately, her tears drying with shocking speed, her small arms wrapping around his neck like she had won a battle. Feeding her was its own war. One afternoon, Adama placed a bowl of mashed yam before her, but the moment Olamma tasted it, her face twisted in anger. She spat it out and screamed. "Mama! It is not smooth." Before Adama could respond, Olamma grabbed the bowl and threw it to the ground. The food scattered across the floor. Adama gasped. "Olamma," she scolded. "You do not behave like that." But Kelechi was already kneeling beside her, fanning her gently with a piece of cardboard. Sorry, our baby," he said quickly. "Mama will fix it." Adama stared at him in disbelief. "Kelechi, stop that nonsense." Her voice was firm now. She must learn. That was when Mozi's voice entered, calm but dangerous. "Learn what?" he asked. He stepped closer, looking at his daughter with nothing but softness. "My daughter will not suffer like other girls." Adama's mouth fell open. "Suffer? Teaching her is suffering." But Obinna had already nodded in agreement. "She is too precious." Chibuzo said nothing, but he quietly picked up another bowl and began mashing the yam himself, carefully pressing out every lump. When he finished, he sat in front of Olamma and began blowing on the food dramatically, his cheeks puffing out with each breath. "It is too hot," he said seriously. "We must cool it for her." Samto, not wanting to be left behind, ran and returned with a palm frond, standing beside her and fanning her like palace guards did for queens in stories. "Eat, my princess," he said proudly. Olamma sat there, her back straight, her tiny chin lifted, opening her mouth slowly as Chibuzo fed her. She did not say thank you. She did not smile. She simply expected it. Adama stood at the doorway, watching the scene unfold before her eyes, her heart heavy with something she could not stop. Something she could not fix. Her daughter was not being raised. She was being worshipped. And nobody else could see the danger. Years passed like Harmattan wind, and the little girl who once rode on backs grew into a young maiden who made the sun look twice. Olamma became stunning, not just beautiful, but the kind of beauty that caused silence when she entered a place. Her skin glowed like fresh cream, her teeth white and proud when she smiled, and her eyes carried a sharpness that could wound without touching. And she knew it. She knew it in the way she walked, slowly, deliberately, her waist moving with careless pride. She knew it in the way she spoke, her voice dripping with superiority. One afternoon, she stopped in front of Mama Urena, who was sitting outside peeling cassava. Olamma looked at her for a long moment, then shook her head and laughed softly. "Mama Urena," she said, her voice loud enough for others to hear, "what happened to your face? You are ugly." The old woman froze, her fingers trembling. Before she could respond, Olamma added, "Even your compound looks tired. Is it poverty that is worrying everything here?" Another day, she stood at the edge of Okafor's farmland, her hands on her waist. "This is your farm?" she asked mockingly. "It is too small. My father's barn is bigger than this." Her words spread quickly, carried by pain and humiliation. The villagers began to murmur. They began to complain. And when the complaints reached Mozi, he did not ask questions. He did not correct his daughter. He exploded. He marched into the center of the village, his voice roaring like thunder. "Who dared shout at my daughter?" he demanded. The air froze. His sons stood behind him like a wall. Obina stepped forward, his eyes hard. "If anyone has something to say," he warned, "say it to us." Kolechi cracked his fingers loudly. "Nobody will disrespect our sister." Chibuzo said nothing, but his silence was more frightening than words. Samto glared at the crowd like a dog ready to bite. Small fights began to break out in the days that followed. Arguments. Shouting. Threats. Fear grew. But so did whispers. "That girl has no respect. Beauty without character is a curse. Her parents have failed her." Inside the compound, Adama's heart was breaking. One evening, she stood in front of Mozi, her eyes filled with tears. "You are not helping her," she pleaded. "You are destroying her." Mozi frowned. "She is my daughter." "She is becoming something else," Adama whispered. But nobody listened. Nobody wanted to listen. And Olamma herself continued to live like someone who had never been told no. She could not even bathe herself properly. One morning, she dipped her foot into her bath water and screamed. "Mama! It is too cold. Do you want me to die?" Adama touched the water. It was warm. Still, Olamma refused. "Samto," she shouted. "Come and check it." She refused to sweep the compound. The day Adama handed her a broom, she stared at it like an enemy. "I cannot do this," she said flatly. "My hands are not for this kind of suffering." Even tying her wrapper was a struggle. She would stand in the middle of her room, frustrated and angry. "Obina," she called. Come and tie it properly. I am tired. And Obina would come. They always came. They always answered. They always served. And slowly, without realizing it, they were building the loneliness that would one day serve her back. As Olamma's beauty ripened, it began to call men the way ripe fruit calls birds. Suitors started arriving, their footsteps careful, their voices respectful, their hearts full of hope. They came with colonnades, with wine, with nervous smiles and dreams of calling the jewel of beauty their wife. The first man, Emeka, was a gentle young farmer with kind eyes and honest hands. He sat upright in the family compound, sweat gathering on his forehead as he spoke. Mozi, I have come with respect. I wish to know your daughter. Olamma stood behind the doorway, listening. She stepped forward slowly, her eyes scanning him from head to toe. Then she laughed. It was not a laugh of joy. It was a laugh of dismissal. This one, she said loudly. He is too short. If I stand beside him, people will think I am his mother. Emeka's smile died instantly. His ears burned with shame. He could not speak. He simply stood up quietly, bowed his head, and left, carrying his rejection like a heavy load. Another suitor came days later, a tall, handsome trader named Obiora. His skin was dark and smooth like polished wood. He spoke confidently, his voice steady. But Olamma tilted her head and smirked. Why is he so dark? She said carelessly. If we enter the night together, nobody will see him. Kelechi burst into loud laughter, slapping his thigh. Obiora's hands tightened, but he swallowed his pride and walked away in silence. Then came a man named Chinedu, humble and sincere, but his clothes were simple, his sandals worn. He presented his colonnades with shaking hands. Before he could finish speaking, Olamma waved her hand dismissively. He looks poor like firewood, she said. If I marry him, will I start suffering? The words cut deeper than knives. The man picked up his things and left, his shoulders bent in defeat. But it was not only Olamma. Her brothers stood like gatekeepers of pride. One afternoon, after another suitor left, Obina shook his head. That one cannot afford her. Kelechi added quickly, and he breathed too loud. I don't like his face. Chibuzo simply said, he's not worthy. Even Somto, who once knew innocence, now nodded in agreement. And Mozi. Mozi sat tall, his chest full of pride, his voice full of dangerous confidence. My daughter deserves the best, he declared. She is not like other girls. His words built walls higher and higher. But in the corner of the compound, Adama sat alone. Her wrapper covered her head as silent tears rolled down her cheeks. She watched each good man leave. She watched her daughter laugh. She watched her husband boast. And her heart broke quietly, piece by piece. Because what they did not know, what they refused to see, was that they were building something grand and empty. They were building a throne, with no kingdom. Hope had almost stopped visiting Mozi's compound when Ikomofuna arrived. He came without noise, without pride, without the desperate performance of the other men who had come before him. He was wealthy, yes, everyone knew that, but he wore his wealth like simple cloth, not like a crown. His voice was calm, his movements gentle, his eyes steady with respect. The day he sat before Mozi, his hands rested humbly on his knees, and when he spoke, his words carried patience. Mozi, he said softly, I have not come to waste your time. I have come because I have seen your daughter, and I wish to build my life with her. The compound was quiet. Olamma stood behind the doorway, her heart beating with something new, something unfamiliar. She stepped out slowly, and for the first time in her life, she did not laugh. She did not insult. She simply looked at him. Ikomofuna met her eyes and smiled gently, not with arrogance, not with fear, but with calm assurance. And somehow, that was enough. The marriage preparations began, and the compound exploded with life once again. Women sang as they pounded yam. Men gathered firewood. Goats bleated. Palm wine flowed. It was a celebration worthy of a princess. On the day of the wedding, Olamma stepped out, and even the sun seemed to pause to look at her. She was radiant. Her beauty was no longer just admired, it was worshipped. Her wrapper hugged her perfectly, her beads rested proudly on her neck, and her face glowed with victory. The villagers whispered, "She has found her king." Ikomofina stood beside her, proud but calm, his eyes never leaving her face. Mozi walked forward slowly, his chest full, his eyes shining with emotion he could not hide. He placed his hand on Ikomofina's shoulder and said firmly, "Take care of my jewel." His voice carried love, but it also carried a warning. Ikomofina nodded respectfully. "I will, Mozi." But even in the middle of celebration, small truths stood quietly in corners. As women carried heavy pots and young girls ran up and down with preparations, Olamma did nothing. She sat comfortably, adjusting her beads, admiring herself, calling others to fix small things for her. "Chioma, bring me water. Amarachi, adjust this for me." She did not lift a finger. Ikomofina noticed. His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than before. He watched as others served her. He watched as she expected it. Something inside him shifted slightly. But he said nothing. He smiled. He ignored it. Because love, or what feels like love, has a way of closing eyes that should be open. The first morning in her husband's house, the sun rose fully, stretched across the sky, and still, Olamma slept. The compound had already come alive. The sound of broom against earth sang its daily song. Pots clanged. Voices moved. But inside, Olamma lay on her mat, wrapped in comfort, lost in the habit of a life where others carried her responsibilities. Ikomofina stood beside her, fully dressed, ready for the day. He watched her for a moment, then spoke gently. "Olamma, morning has come." She turned slowly, her face tightening with annoyance. "Why are you waking me?" she muttered. The night was too short. Ikomofina forced a small smile. "My wife, morning work is important." She sat up reluctantly, her face heavy with complaint. That afternoon, when food was served, she tasted it and frowned. "What is this?" she snapped. The house helper, Obiajili, froze. "It is soup, my madam." Olamma dropped the spoon. "It is tasteless. Do you expect me to eat this rubbish?" The girl lowered her head, ashamed. Olamma hissed and pushed the bowl away. Days passed, and her voice grew sharper. "Obiajili. Bring water. Obiajili. Fix this." She spoke like someone born to command, not to belong. One evening, Ikomofina sat beside her. "Can you cook tomorrow?" he asked softly. Olamma stared at him, then laughed. "Cook? Me?" She laughed harder. "You must be joking." By the second week, the tension had grown teeth. One morning, Ikomofina handed her a broom. "Please, sweep the compound." Olamma looked at it like it had insulted her. "Sweep," she repeated slowly. She dropped it instantly. "Sweeping is for poor women. I am not poor." Ikomofina's face hardened slightly. "Olamma," but before he could finish, she stormed into the kitchen, grabbed a plate, and smashed it on the ground. The sound shattered more than clay. "I will not live like this," she shouted. By the third week, the neighbors had begun to talk. Their whispers traveled faster than wind. "She does not greet. She does not walk. She insults everyone." Ikomofina felt the shame crawling onto his skin. One evening, he tried again, his voice calm, his heart patient. "Olamma," he said, sitting beside her, "let me show you how to cook. It is not difficult." She turned to him slowly, her eyes filled with disbelief. Then she laughed. She laughed until tears formed in her eyes. You want to teach me? Me, she mocked. You should have married a maid. Something inside Ikomafuna broke quietly. By the 4th week, the break-in was complete. He stood in front of Mozi's compound, his face heavy, his shoulders tired. Olamma stood behind him, her arms folded, her face unapologetic. Mozi stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. What is this? Ikomafuna spoke, his voice calm but final. She cannot even fetch water. She insults my mother. She sleeps till midday. The words hit like stones. Obinna stepped forward immediately. Watch your mouth. Kelechi shouted, his fist tightening. How dare you speak about our sister like that? Chibuzo moved closer, silent but ready. Somto's face burned with anger. They surrounded him. But before violence could speak, Adama's voice cut through. Stop, she shouted. Everyone froze. Tears ran down her face. Enough, she said weakly. Her eyes turned to Olamma, filled with pain deeper than words. Ikomafuna looked at them one last time, his eyes empty of hope. He said nothing more. He simply turned and walked away, shaking his head slowly. And as he disappeared into the distance, the whispers of the village grew louder than ever. Time moved quietly, carrying the sons of Mozi into their own lives. Obinna, ever steady and protective, found Ifunanya, a woman with gentle hands and a soft voice that could calm storms. Kelechi, loud and dramatic, chose Amarachi, whose laughter matched his own and whose spirit was fierce enough to keep him in check. Chibuzo, silent but strong, married Oluchi, a woman who understood the power of quiet strength. And Somto, playful and curious, found Chioma, whose eyes always sparkled with mischief and kindness. Some of the brothers moved to their own homes, building compounds where laughter and toil blended. Some stayed nearby, keeping their families close to the old homestead. Soon, the sound of children's feet filled the air. Tiny hands reached for bread, small voices called for mothers, laughter tumbled over walls and into the open fields. Life returned to the house in waves, a tide of energy that had long been missing. Yet in the midst of this joy, one presence remained unchanged. Olamma sat in her corner, demanding, expecting, lazy as ever. She would call, Chioma, bring me water. Amarachi, adjust my wrapper. She took, never gave, never moved. And quietly, almost in whispers, the brothers began to protect their own children from her influence. Obinna leaned toward Ifunanya one afternoon. Do not let Olamma teach our daughters anything, he said. Kelechi nodded to Amarachi. Keep her away from your children. They must not learn from her. Chibuzo told Oluchi softly, our girls must grow with sense, not entitlement. Somto added with a wink to Chioma, she is a jewel, but a dangerous one. For the first time, Olamma noticed it, the distance. The way children ran past her, giggling but careful not to linger. The way her nieces and nephews avoided her touch. For the first time, a shadow of confusion and hurt passed across her face. She opened her mouth to speak, to demand, to scold, but no one waited for her. The compound, once her stage, now whispered of limits she had never known. And in that moment, Olamma felt, perhaps for the first time, that even jewels can be left alone. Years had worn Adama down like gentle rain carving stone. Her hair, once thick and dark as night, now trembled with silver. Her hands shook when she poured water. Her back bent slightly under the weight of years spent loving a daughter who could not love herself. One afternoon, she called Olamma to sit beside her. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of a mother's fear. My daughter, what will happen when we are gone? Olamma laughed, a bright, careless sound that bounced through the empty room. Mama, do not worry, she said, stretching her small hands. My brothers are here. I am not alone. Adama's hands fell into her lap, and tears ran freely down her cheeks. "They are not your husband," she said, voice breaking. "They cannot build a home for you. They cannot teach you to stand." Her words hung heavy in the air. Later, she turned to Mozi, her eyes pleading, her body trembling with exhaustion. "Mozi, you have ruined her," she said, almost whispering, almost hoping he would deny it. But Mozi grew silent. His hands gripped the chair. His chest heaved slowly. He remembered every time he had protected her from work, every time he had let her laugh at others, every time he had refused to teach her discipline. Regret sank into him like a river carving valleys. Days passed quietly, and Adama grew frailer. One evening, she lay still, her breath shallow, her eyes closed, and she died without sound, without fanfare, leaving the compound emptier than ever. Olamma screamed, a scream that split the walls, that shook the trees outside, that carried through the village. "Mama! Mama!" she cried, flinging herself across the floor. But even as she cried, she did not understand. She did not understand that the loss she felt was the one person who had truly loved her, the one who had tried to shape her, had gone forever. And the sound of her sobs echoed through the empty house, a daughter lost in grief she could not name, a jewel who did not yet know how to shine. After Adama's death, Mozi became a shadow of the man he once was. His steps slowed, his voice softened, and the booming presence that had once commanded respect in the village faded like mist over morning fields. The farm, once a place of abundance, began to decline. Yams were smaller, goats wandered without care, and the barns that had been bursting with harvest now echoed emptily. From the veranda, Mozi would watch other young women in neighboring compounds, wives of men not as wealthy, not as proud, yet somehow they managed their homes with grace, with order, with dignity. He would sit silently, remembering. Remembering every time Adama had tried to teach Olamma a simple task. Remembering every time he had stopped her. Every plate that went unwashed, every fire left unattended, every command he had granted, thinking he was protecting a jewel. One afternoon, hunger gnawed at him. He called out, his voice weaker than it used to be. "Olamma, come, cook for me." Olamma appeared, her head high, her eyes flicking with annoyance. She stirred the pot clumsily, impatiently, and when the soup was done, smoke curled from the burnt surface. She handed it to him with a proud smile. Mozi sniffed, tasted, and sighed so heavily it seemed to carry the weight of decades. "I should have listened," he muttered, not for her, not even for himself, but for the ghost of a wife who had tried to guide them all. Years passed quietly. Mozi grew weaker, his hands trembling, his chest heavy with silent regret. One evening, he lay on his mat, his eyes closed, the setting sun casting long shadows across the empty compound. His last words were soft, almost a whisper that barely brushed the ears of those present. "I should have listened," and then he was gone, leaving behind silence heavier than any sound he had ever made, leaving behind a daughter who had never learned, and a legacy of love mixed with failure. Years rolled on like drifting smoke. The sons of Mozi built their own homes, raised their own children, and carried the weight of their own lives. The laughter of little feet that once filled the old compound now belonged to others, far away. Visits became rare. Calls were hurried. Time was scarce. And Olamma. And the village whispered. It always whispered. Mothers shook their heads when their daughters laughed at her antics. "See that girl? That woman," they said. "Do not raise another Olamma." Her life had become a cautionary tale, a story told by elders with sharp tongues and heavy hearts, the kind of story that made children shiver and parents pray. And Olamma, proud as ever, did not understand the warning she had become. She only knew hunger for attention, for service, for the world to move at her whim, a world that no longer cared, a world that had quietly moved on. Olamma sat alone on the veranda, her old bones heavy, her hands folded over each other, her eyes staring into nothing. The sun had long dipped behind the hills, leaving the compound bathed in shadows. The wind moved through the empty yard, rattling the doors, carrying whispers of the past. Her voice, soft and trembling, broke the silence. "Mama, why didn't you force me?" she whispered, barely audible, like a prayer lost to the sky. For the first time, the weight of every missed lesson, every spoiled demand, every protected moment pressed on her chest. She finally understood, but the understanding came too late. The compound, once alive with laughter and voices, breathed emptiness. Goats wandered. Leaves rustled. The wind swept past like a ghost of what could have been. And in that quiet, the narrator's voice, steady and solemn, carried over the scene. "A jewel must be polished to shine. If you only protect it, it will remain stone." The words lingered, heavy and true, as Olamma closed her eyes, the echo of law's guidance and missed love settling around her like dust. "Train your daughters to stand, so they will not fall when you are gone."